Okay, I only have 5 minutes for this one because I made it for a class, so strap in, we got a lot of ground to cover. Genre, comics, comic book movies. Wow! Ooh, wow! Very cool! Okay, question of the day. Are comic book movies their own genre? I'll give you a moment to discuss between yourselves. I don't care. All right, here we go. The Marvel Cinematic Universe and its consequences have been a disaster for film as a whole. Well, not really, but they've had some weird effects that I'm not sure I'm a fan of, like the relative death of the movie star, encouraging studios not to take on mid-budget movies, giving every studio the idea that they need to have cinematic universes in the first place. Point is, another consequence of the prevalence of these movies is that people have started referring to the MCU and other superhero movies as comic book movies. Not just superhero movies, though, but seemingly anything that is adapted from a comic book, which makes defining what outlines a comic book movie extremely difficult. All right, so say we were to do that. All right, is there a way to do that? Personally, I think the strongest argument for why comic book movies could be their own genre is the unique kind of continuity they have. Now, granted, this would only apply to the MCU and its derivatives, so we'd be leaving out a great deal of standalone movies with this definition, but hear me out anyway. The MCU is built upon a continuity of independent films and stories that all service the same end goal and all clearly have effects on one another, despite most of them not being explicit sequels to each other. Endgame is the strongest argument, in my opinion, for why comic book movies could be their own genre. Due to this kind of interwoven storytelling that the MCU has established, if you were to watch Endgame without seeing any of the other MCU films that came before it, you'd be completely lost. It's like each movie is its own comic book, and movies like Endgames are those big special issues that serve to tie them all together somehow. The way the MCU chooses to tell its story is unique, and the fact that other studios keep trying, and usually failing, to replicate it could be seen as proof that this is a genre that is worth dignifying as its own thing. However, Blair Davis's book Comic Book Movies has a chapter called Genre, and in that chapter she outlines a pretty good argument as to why comic book movies aren't their own genre, and it's right there in the name. Comic book movie. What the hell does that mean? You have an idea of what to expect walking into a sci-fi movie, a horror movie, a romance movie, etc. But all you're getting from the term comic book movie is that these events or characters featured in this movie originated in a different medium. Davis writes, using an entire medium to describe a certain group of films is an exercise in futility because a medium itself is not a genre. Going on to say, we wouldn't refer to Transformers or Lego film franchises simply as toy movies because the term tells us nothing about the types of characters, settings, or storylines we might expect to find. I think she's making a lot of sense here. Quick side note, we're talking a lot about genres. Let's actually define what a genre is before we get too nebulous. There's this guy, Rick Altman. He wrote an article in the Cinema Journal called A semantic/syntactic approach to film genre that has a pretty good dissection of what actually makes a genre. He divided it into two parts. The semantic, which are the typical characters or character types, settings, shots, locations, basically everything you'd call the essential building blocks of the story, and the syntactic, which are essentially definitions of certain relationships that occur between undesigned and variable placeholders. Before we get to examples, here's a passage about how Altman thinks genres usually come about. I suggest that genres arise in one of two fundamental ways. Either a relatively stable set of semantic givens is developed through syntactic experimentation into a coherent and durable syntax, or an already existing syntax adopts a new set of semantic elements. Now, if we're to use this model as a way of assigning new genres to a certain kind of film, can we make the MCU and other comic book movies fit within this mold? And the answer is... I personally don't really think so, although it's up to you. Genre is a difficult, nebulous area of film criticism sometimes. A lot of people just say genre is a thing that you know when you see more than a hard line drawn in the sand. And if you can define a specific field that most every comic book movie has in common, good for you. Have fun. However, in my opinion, I don't really think comic book movies warrant their own genre. There's a book by Neil Archer called 21st Century Hollywood, Rebooting the System that has a chapter that talks about the style of the MCU's catalog, and in it he claims that the films making up Marvel and DC cinematic universes do not strive at all to mark their graphic origin, nor do they usually strive to distinguish themselves from other modes of cinematic verisimilitude at work across more obviously realistic genres. The most immediate effect of this is to bolster the verisimilitude of these story worlds central to these comic universes' coherence and believability. Continuity across multiple episodes, the hallmark of the new franchise film, is therefore underpinned by a very traditional notion of continuity style within the individual films themselves, which basically means that despite the fact that the MCU and DCEU are being told in a way that is somewhat remarkable, the films themselves that make up this overarching story aren't actually doing anything to set themselves apart, which I agree with. Logan, Western, Captain America 2, spy thriller, Ant-Man, heist movie. These comic book movies are, as far as genre is concerned, most often referred to as comic book movie first. But since that doesn't actually tell you anything about the movie itself, people most often refer instead to the genre space they operate within below that. You don't call movies adapted from literature book movies. And if you do, that's weird, and you're weird.